So it's really great to have you here, Seth. Of the Babylon Bee, as is broadcast through your baseball cap. I wanted to sort of start with my condolences because I know that the Babylon Bee and yourself have endorsed Kamala Harris, and apparently she lost by a hair. So I'm very sorry for your loss.
You know, when I posted that tearful video, I just couldn't
Mm-hmm.
believe that despite my endorsement and Taylor Swift's and Megan Thee Stallions, that, it all fell apart. But apparently celebrity endorsements aren't what they used to be.
No, that seems to be the case, which is unfortunate because I do think that our politics and the world's politics should really be decided by celebrities
They
who
should,
are
absolutely.
the most informed, right?
Yeah, we could
Yeah.
go we could go straight through this the whole time. And I'm like, I wonder if your audience will get that we're kidding. Uh,
I've done a podcast about running a cult and my aspirations to do that, and I was getting some advice from a knowledgeable friend, and let's just say the comments suggest that not everyone got it,
yeah.
but I like the deadpan humor. That's my favorite, probably because I can't make people like full on laugh, so that's what I have to settle for
Some people
is
just don't
deadpan.
speak the language of sarcasm, and you can never win with them.
I've lost many friendships that way, and I'm like, I really like you, and they think I hate me. I hate them, and it's like, no, I'm being sarcastic. I would never say something mean. Anyways, when I first heard of the Babylon Bee, it was sent to me by like liberals, and who didn't know that the Babylon Bee was a more conservative publication. It's just the satire was good, and that's how I found out about it, because you were making fun of really the establishment and
Yeah.
crazy ideas, and I don't think I even picked up on the fact that it was a conservative media outlet until a little bit later, and I wasn't in the ecosystem of politics at all, so I didn't understand any of that. Do you get that a lot?
Yeah, it could be easy to miss. I mean, depending on what gets shared in your circles, there are plenty of headlines that we've done targeting people on the right. We've done probably more jokes about Trump, many of them, friendly jokes that are at the expense of the people attacking him and not necessarily at his, but we've done a lot at his expense too. And so, depending on what you see coming through your feed, you have no idea where we're coming from. If you look at it though, and you scroll through the feed and you see that vast majority of the jokes that we make, you can kind of tell where we're coming at the issues from, politically, religiously. Um, but
Hmm.
we do there's a lot of people that are outside the bubble of where, the B stuff gets shared, and they come across it. They don't know what to make of it. A lot of them think the headlines are real, which I also can't blame them for, because real headlines are often absurd enough that they're hard to distinguish from satire.
Well, you make fun of both sides, I would say, even though there is certainly an editorial slant there that's more sympathetic to conservatives. But, satire was I would say, a more equal opportunity player in the past, where you've had The Onion and Saturday Night Live. And what I would see is that whoever was in power, whoever was doing crazy things would get made fun of. And then I think you started seeing this hesitance to do that, especially more in the kind of mainstream,
Hmm.
because it was seen almost like, well, we can't afford to do that because the other side might win, or something like that.
Yeah,
So
we
now
get
it's like,
criticism like that. There are people who criticize us and say that we should never make fun of Trump, for example, because we damage him, we hurt him, and we shouldn't do that. It's like, well, I appreciate that you think we have that kind of power, uh, but I do think humorists, satirists should be equal opportunity, in the sense that they're not just hands off on their side because they want to protect their side. I mean, the point is to be funny, for one. So whatever's funny, tell those jokes. And the other is to, speak the truth and confront bad ideas and double standards wherever you find them. And so you can find them anywhere you look. Honestly, they don't exist just on one side of the political spectrum. So there's a lot of fodder there wherever you go.
do you think the popularity of the bee is somewhat derived from the fact that these, like The Onion and other kinds of outlets that were known for satire stopped sort of doing it where it wasn't doing it on their side, let's say.
Yeah, well, if you go back a couple of years, there's actually something Rogan said on his show. He said, that there are so many things that deserve to be made fun of that the comedians aren't willing to make fun of. The like you mentioned the Saturday Night Lives or the late shows or whatever. There was a real effort to kind of insulate their own side from criticism, including mockery and comedy. And so there were these sacred cows they didn't want to touch, and there was this protective stuff going on, and it opened up an opportunity for somebody to step in there and actually tell some of these jokes that the other comedians weren't willing to tell. And when you're willing to go there, especially on the issues where there's a lot of absurdity, some of the woke stuff and the attendant nonsense that came with that, including men and women's sports, or the gender affirming care, I put that in scare quotes, for kids, some of these things that were really out there that damaged the left politically. They deserve to be mocked. At one point they were mocked. I remember Dennis Prager being laughed off the set at Bill Maher's show for talking about how they were starting to put tampons in boys' bathrooms. And Bill Maher thought that was ridiculous. He's like, that's not true. That can't be happening. And his audience was mocking Dennis Prager. It's like, no, it's really happening. And so they were either ignoring it or refusing to make fun of these things. And so, yes, I think that did lead to a rise in our popularity because we were willing to go there and tell those jokes. And that's exactly what Rogan said. He said, the funniest stuff out there right now is the woke stuff, and no one's willing to make fun of it except the Babylon Bee. And that's why the Babylon Bee is so popular.
Yeah, it's interesting as I'm hearing you talk about it. It really reminds me of the importance of the court gesture,
Yeah.
and in terms of having like healthy discourse, I don't think comedy gets taken seriously, uh, ironically, but in a way, it's like you kind of need to make fun of problematic or kind of ridiculous ideas or over the top things in order for it's like a way of it's almost like it's a way of addressing it without having to get all sort of serious about it, and it's like it's humor is funny when everybody sort of recognizes that little grain of truth, and
Yes.
then you don't have that.
That's what makes it funny, but it's a check and balance too. You have checks and balances in government. You need checks and balances in culture too, where you're willing to push back on the bad ideas, some of the ideas which are insane, and because if you take insane ideas seriously, then you become insane yourself. It's a way of checking and guarding yourself against insanity, lunacy, the madness that's taken over and started to prevail in the culture. And so when right becomes wrong and good becomes evil and the inverse of everything, it's all flipped upside down. It's like we're living in the upside down. Comedy has a very important role to play in telling the truth and exposing the kind of the madness for what it is, so that it isn't taken seriously. So it's not just entertaining. I mean, that's part of it. It makes you laugh, but it also serves that purpose of being let's stop and think about this and reconsider this and whether or not we actually want to take these things seriously and treat them with the dignity of respect instead of the contempt of mockery, which they actually deserve. And so I think it's, there's a twofold purpose there.
Yeah. You mentioned in a speech of yours that you got fact checked about a claim that the Bee made about CNN using industrial washing machine to spin the news before publishing it.
Yeah.
Is humor under attack?
Well, yeah. So that was, if you rewind a little bit, that was in 2018. This is years ago now. Facebook was under tremendous pressure because Trump had been elected in 2016, and Zuckerberg and the rest of the big tech guys were taking a lot of heat for playing a part and allowing that to happen because they didn't do enough to clamp down on the spread of misinformation. And so they started working with third-party fact checkers to fact check sites and give them, quality score ratings on how truthful they were. And comedy started getting caught up in that. And I don't think it was necessarily a direct attack on comedy itself. Like it was, humorless scolds just telling you what you can and can't laugh about. It was very political. And there was some uneven treatment there where we were being fact checked at a rate much higher than, for example, the Onion, which was coming at the issues from a different perspective. And the fact checks would say things like, they've managed to dupe people before with these ruses. They're trafficking in misinformation and under the guise of satire. That was something the New York Times said, actually.
Mm.
And so we were in this weird place where we're like, guys, we're just telling jokes. Like, we're trying to be funny here. And you're treating it as if we're using the guise of comedy to just mislead people. We're not presenting these stories as if they're true. They are, as you said, they have a grain of truth in them. But a headline like CNN purchases industrial sized washing machine to spin the news in before publishing it is a jab at CNN, but it's obviously not meant to be taken seriously. It's not a statement of fact. So that got fact checked, and we were threatened with getting kicked off Facebook if we kept spreading fake news like that. And so,
Wow.
that was really the start of our experience with big tech censorship of the Bee, was the aggressive fact checking of our headlines, and then the threats that came along with that. And so, it became this battle where we're like, look, we should be allowed to tell jokes. You shouldn't be giving jokes a truth rating. That's insane. That itself is a joke.
Were you kicked off of Twitter because of something like that? Was that related? I don't remember anymore.
Yeah, we got suspended on Twitter twice. Once they claimed it was a mistake. It may well have been, I don't know, but we got suspended several years ago, and they said that it was like they were cracking down on bots or spam, and we got caught up in some spam filter or whatever. They apologized and reinstated us. So it wasn't really clear what happened there. That
Hmm.
was their claim. And then later on, yeah, we had in 2022, we were responding to a headline. We see these, I mentioned the real headlines looking absurd. Well, there was a headline about how USA Today had named Rachel Levine, the transgender health admiral in the Biden administration. They named Rachel Levine their pick for Woman of the Year. And, this is a male person. And so we're like, okay, that's crazy. How do we exaggerate that? How do we parody that? It seems like a parody already. It's like something you'd see in South Park. And so we told a joke about how our pick for Man of the Year was Rachel Levine. That was our response to that headline. And of course, that was different than misinformation. This was what Twitter considered hateful conduct because we were misgendering somebody.
Right.
So
Okay.
we were locked out of our account, and that's when that's how we caught Elon Musk's attention. And he's like, this is crazy. Comedy should be
So we
legal.
have you to blame for what's happening with X now.
Well,
Thanks a lot.
only in part. Elon, unknown to us at the time, Elon had his eye on this problem. We had interviewed him a little bit before this happened, several months before this happened, and he had talked about the danger of wokeness. He called it divisive, exclusionary, and hateful, and said it was a threat to civilization, and that you need these are ideas that need to be confronted, they need to be dealt with. And then when the censorship was on his radar, he was seeing that there were a lot of voices being silenced and suppressed, and then the Babylon Bee, of course, gets kicked off. He had already in the background been kind of buying up stock in Twitter and kind of positioning himself to try to get on the board. And then this happened, and he called us, and we had a conversation with him about it. And he was using on that call, he's like, maybe I just need to buy Twitter.
Hmm.
And so it was like, this was something that was in his mind that he was thinking about. And it was one more example of how speech was being curtailed. You couldn't even tell jokes about the things that he thought really were bad ideas that needed to be dealt with. So he's like, this is not free speech. This is not the way you get to the truth. You have to be able to have both sides hash it out and argue about these things, and yes, joke about these things in order to kind of decide what we're okay with and what is actually true. And so, we don't take full credit for Elon Musk buying Twitter. I don't think he spent
Or
$44
full
billion,
blame.
yeah, just to unlock our account. But he did,
It
he was a fan of the Bee, and he was bothered by the fact that we were locked out. So it was certainly one of the more prominent and notable examples of censorship that caught his attention.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I think I obviously will, I agree with the idea of like we need, opposing views to basically do battle with each other or engage in dialogue with each other to sort of get closer to what the truth might be.
Mhm.
Um, I think the problem that we see on social media platforms, all social media platforms, is that you've got a lot of things that get amplified just because of the algorithms of how they work or because of rage, and you do have fake stories, like verifiably false stories, that get spread at a much quicker pace. And there's been studies on that. So
Yeah.
that's like, I think, a struggle because you don't have that kind of idealistic environment or utopian environment that we think that we want, like that whole expression of sunshine is the best disinfectant. Well,
Yeah.
it isn't if the infection is so big but the sunshine can't get through, or rather, or the correction of
Right.
so how do balancing that is incredibly difficult.
It is. Free speech is messy, and people will abuse it to say things that are harmful and false. Um, and you have to make a decision on how you handle that. What do you do with that? Do you take away the voice and the platform, or suppress the voices of people who are abusing the free speech to mislead people on purpose? Because some people, we weren't misleading people on purpose, but there, like you
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge, there are people who do. They just
Mm-hmm.
flat out lie, and there's some sites that actually try to use satire as a way out of spreading misinformation. They would just put a crazy headline out there, like, Kevin Hart dies in car accident. Like, that's the headline. And he didn't, in fact, die in a car accident. And it's not funny. That's not satire. But then they would label it satire as if it was a joke. But it would get all this engagement and drive all this traffic. And, like, that's like with
I
people
think
who are saying things that are false and doing it deliberately. I mean, one thing I do like community notes as an answer to that to some extent, because community notes, instead of taking away someone's voice, attaches context or whatever. It's more speech in response to the false speech or the harmful speech, whatever you want to call it. Um, it's it it's more of that kind of dialogue that countering bad speech with a correction, rather than countering the speech that you don't like with censorship that takes away somebody's voice. And so I think that is one. It's not perfect, but it is a productive way that honors the right of people to say things even that we don't like.
Yeah, no, I'm quite a proponent of community notes as well. While absolutely not a perfect system, maybe AI would play a role in factual corrections as well. Again, people can see the original, but they can't see, but they also see the correction. They can decide for themselves. I think that would go a long way. I think there's a lot of design elements also that can improve, just even interface changes that might be able to play a role in this. Always kind of thinking about, okay, how can we have this free speech but counteract, you know, falsehoods or misleading things. I mean, we might have different views on moderation.
Mhm.
I think I started out being a little bit more absolutist, and have changed my mind since. I just think that moderation shouldn't be based on, ideology or opinions. It should be based on behavior. So, for example, because I think it's quite harmful or detrimental to free speech if, for example, somebody states their opinion and just gets attacked by a mob of people, harassed and doxxed and all those kinds of things. That to me also removes somebody from the conversation. So I think looking at that way also is worthwhile, but it
Yeah.
is, as you
Yeah,
said,
I
messy.
don't think that there's no room for I wouldn't say there's no room for moderation. What I think is dangerous is when you start getting into the territory of deciding, when we're talking about, okay, misinformation is a good thing to focus on, because something, when you're deciding, when a platform is deciding what's true and what's false, and then they're deciding what you can say and what you can't say, have with a predetermined conclusion about what's true and what's false. And the problem is, like, I think COVID, it really highlighted this. We had the restrictions on what you could say about the science surrounding COVID, like the origins of the virus, or whether masking was effective, or whether the vaccines were effective, or if they did harm. Like, the debate that was happening there was settled, by, as far as the tech companies were concerned, by whatever the health organizations were saying, the CDC was saying, or whatever. They're like, this is the truth. You can't say anything that contradicts the truth. Well, then, of course, you had studies come out, and evolution of what our understanding was of the origins of the virus, or what the effective treatments were for it, and how effective the treatments were for it, and what the causes of death were. And all of these things happened over the course of time, where it began to change. The opinions on this began to change, and so what was false 2 weeks ago was suddenly true today.
Hmm.
And so if it's true that knowledge changes over time, and science is a great example of this, because science uncovers truth over the course of time, and it requires debate to get there, to try to find the truth. If you ever have a predetermined conclusion where you say, no, this is what's true, and you can't say it, it may be the case that next week, something different is true. And so it turns out that you censored people who were speaking the truth at the time based on what you thought was the case. And so that is to me, that's a knockdown argument against censorship, because you can't
Yeah.
make these predetermined judgments about what should be sayable and what shouldn't. That's where debate needs to come into the picture, and people should be able to say things like, I don't believe that A, B, or C is effective. And then other people can say why they think that it is. And then you have that conversation rather than telling people they can't, because you might actually be censoring people who are saying something true.
Absolutely. I will throw out this though. I mean, I think there's this kind of relativist attitude towards truth where people are like, well, what is true? There is no such thing as truth. Whereas when I speak of truth, I speak not of opinions, I speak of like verifiable facts. You can verify that on such and such date, this is what happened, and this, you can verify, okay, the vaccines were released on this day, whatever, like, a more concrete sort of example would be. And so those kinds of things I think we can tackle a bit more. Or an example that I just recently saw of something spreading that was an absolute lie, and it wasn't even misinformation, it was disinformation, right? Was so it was a post. So it was story. It was about Zelensky being pressured by three different politicians and told to stand up to Trump. Right. The first story was the person who posted it. It's a smaller social media account, but still sizable. Got a bit of attention. Literally fabricated this as just her thinking invention, fantastical. And underneath, at some point, she responded. She wrote, "I'm just imagining this, but that's probably what happened, right?" So she wasn't being serious. The next tweet that sort of went big was another account saying, "Rumors have it that
Mm-hmm.
blah blah blah." The next one was being reported now as fact. And
Mm.
then the last one was it went all the way to somebody at the White House who's like, this is legally serious, right? And this is an example on the right, but those kinds of things also happen very much on the left. Those are pretty serious things, and don't know how to deal with them. At some point where people are going to repeat it, they're going to think that this is true and aren't intentionally spreading something false because they think it's true. So that complicates it even further.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm not going to argue that it's not complicated. Like I'll go back to what I said before. Free speech is messy, but it's my view that the answer to it is to, if there is something that's stated that's false, is to refute it. You can refute it if it's silly and absurd. You can ridicule it and mock it, but you shouldn't take away the voice of people saying it, and you shouldn't be trying to decide what is true. Now, there are things, yeah, you mentioned like facts, like things that are indisputable, like 2 and 2 equals 4. That's a fact. Well, I still think that people should be able to argue that 2 and 2 equals 5, which, they do. You can actually find people. There is a discourse on this. There's Reddit threads and debates happening on X right now about whether or not 2 and 2 can, in some cases, equal 5, or whether or not it's racist to insist that 2 and 2 only equals 4. Like, these are things that people are actually talking about, and should they be allowed to? Yeah, I mean, that's speech. It's silly, it's insane, it's dumb. But you're allowed to be wrong. Yeah, free speech
Yeah.
is, as far as I'm concerned, the right to be wrong. And that's just comes as part of the territory, and it's not great that there are things that are being said deliberately that mislead people and lead to bad outcomes. Of course, that's not a good thing, but it is something that we have the freedom to do, and we have a mechanism for dealing with it. First of all, if you one of the things that's almost never brought into these discussions, which I think needs to be talked about more, is the fact that there is actually a lot of control given to users. The algorithms are a problem. I agree with that, but users do have a lot of control over who they listen to. And so somebody who repeatedly lies and says things that are harmful or hateful or whatever, you can block them, you can mute them, you can tune them out. You don't have to listen to them, or you could respond to them. I think that the last thing that you want to do is take away their voice and say that they can't speak. The minute the power's in someone else's hands, they will treat you as the person who's saying things that are beyond the pale and they're hateful and harmful, and they will take away your voice. And so it's a dangerous road to go down.
Do you see a distinction between free speech under the First Amendment, which is basically the government can go after you for your speech, versus, in a private setting?
Yeah.
It seems like, yeah.
Oh, for sure. Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, I run a company, privately owned business, uh, I wouldn't, for example, tolerate one of my customer service agents cursing out one of my customers. I would say that, that is a fireable offense, and I would terminate them for doing that. I wouldn't honor their free speech right under the First Amendment to use, the F word talking to one of our customers or something like that. It doesn't apply in certain settings. I wouldn't tolerate my children disrespecting my wife and saying something terrible to her in our home. It's speech that I won't allow. But that they're very distinct from First Amendment issues. And the First Amendment is specifically designed to protect us from the government infringing on our right to speak in the public square. The big conversation around that everyone's trying to figure out, including the courts right now, is trying to figure out, to what extent do privately owned platforms that hold themselves out as platforms for free expression without barriers. That's wording from Twitter's original mission statement. The platform for free expression without barriers. To what extent do these platforms, when they become big enough, when they become the de facto town square, this is where the vast majority of public discourse takes place, to what extent is there a responsibility to honor the right of people to disagree in the public square? And to say things that, a speech that you may not like? Do they have a responsibility to do that? Well, for one thing, if they're holding themselves out as platforms for free expression, and that's in their terms, I think they've put that responsibility on themselves. But whether there's a legal responsibility there, you can make arguments that these are they become essentially like common carriers. There are regulations that regulate transportation or communications technology companies that prevent them from discriminating against people based on their innate characteristics or their viewpoints or whatever. There is some precedent for regulation of those kinds of things, and so there may come a point at which we have something like that for these online platforms. Where, like I said, the vast majority of public, you're not talking in the public, like the actual town square anymore. You're
Yeah.
talking online. That's where people speak. If you don't have free speech there, in the modern digital age, you essentially don't have free speech anymore. So that's a challenging issue, and the courts still have to figure that out.
Yeah, I've seen that you've been sort of had some engagement where, you might have criticized people, like behaviors on the right in particular, where they don't align with values that you claim to hold. And you sort of, it's kind of interesting to observe that and see people say, well, you're suppressing my free speech when you're actually using yours to disagree, which is the whole point.
You were breaking up just a little bit there. You said I was saying things that people on the right disagree with, and then you broke up a
Yeah,
little bit. Sorry.
okay, yeah, I'll repeat it. So I've seen you call a behavior on the right where it didn't align with the values that you have claimed to hold.
Mhm.
And people would sort of go back at you and say, well, you're oppressing our freedom of speech, whereas versus, as I'm viewing it, it's like, well, you're clearly just practicing yours to
Right.
argue with theirs, which is the whole point of free speech. Why do you
Yeah.
think there's this kind of disconnect there?
Well, I think that's a rhetorical tactic. It's a tactic that's meant to insulate yourself from criticism. Is to claim that when you're being criticized, oh, I'm being censored. Oh, this is something I'm not allowed to talk about. Look at all the criticism I'm getting. They don't want me to talk. They want me deplatformed. They want to take my voice away. It's like, no, I'm not ending the conversation by responding to you. I'm contributing to the conversation by responding to you. And there is a huge distinction there. I'm not, when I disagree with somebody on my own side, for example, I'm not calling for them to be silenced. I'm just saying that they're wrong about something. And, of course, yeah, I have every right to do that. It's just a response. It's not it's not shutting them down or suppressing or silencing them. And I do think that that's just a tactic that people use to try to position themselves as the victim of oppression and of censorship, and to smear whoever they're engaged with, rather than actually dealing with the actual argument. And so it's a fallacy, if anything. Back to
Yeah.
real quick, just back to the First Amendment thing, because there's another thought I wanted to tack on there. Is
Hmm.
there is there have been examples of the government applying pressure on these platforms to censor on their behalf. We have some actual concrete examples of that. And so my commentary before was talking about, the tech companies making their own if they're making their own determinations about what should be moderated. Does the First Amendment apply there? No, under current law it doesn't. They're privately owned platforms. Unless the law changes or we reinterpret the law to say that it does apply to them for some reason, they have the right to do that. But if the government is using them to do that which would be unconstitutional for them to do themselves, then that does become a violation of the First Amendment. So that's an important point to realize, is there is some of that going on, and there's an effort in the current administration now to put an end to that.
There's definitely that going on, and a lot of that was going on during the pandemic too,
Yeah.
and it was with things that did turn out to be true.
Even
I,
jokes. I mean, there were specific examples of where satire and comedy were being flagged. Like, people in government were saying, "This, please review this post. This needs to get taken down." They're flagging these things and bringing it to the attention of Facebook, Meta, or Twitter, and through the back door saying, implying pressure to them, and then Congress, making all these threats against these big tech overlords and saying, we're going to strip away your Section 230 protections if you don't censor more misinformation and hate speech. And so when the government gets involved with a heavy hand that way, yes, I definitely think that's a First Amendment issue for sure. It's clearly a First Amendment issue. What's less clear is the platform's own conduct when they start engaging in moderation, and to what extent they can or should be doing that. But I do think legal arguments can be made, and some have even alluded to what the potential options and possibilities could be there. Justice Thomas among them, for finding a solution there where there is some regulation that protects free speech in the digital public square.
do you feel like there's been, because I've noticed that a lot of the people who sort of aligned on the free speech stuff and wanted to support that, I've noticed that as soon as they sort of got power, they did start to suppress other people's speech, or wanted to, or had that inclination. Have you observed that as well? And what do you think is behind that, if so?
You mean like specifically like conservatives who were like pro free speech right up until
Yeah.
now they have power and now they want to shut down people on the other side?
Yeah.
I guess we'd probably have to look at specific examples of that to really to deal with it. But I think it's kind of a natural inclination that people have, is they when they're on the opposite side, when they're the victim of it, they see the wrongness of it. And then when they're in that position where they hold that power, all of a sudden, uh, the rules don't apply any longer, and they want to do the same thing that was done to them. And I think that's very problematic. I think that if you're gonna object to it when one side's doing it, you have to be consistent with yourself. You have to hold to the principle itself, and honor the right of people to disagree with you. And generally, I think free speech loving conservatives like myself are perfectly happy to honor the right of other people to disagree with us. And there's a lot of people that say a lot of things that I strongly disagree with, but and I'll give a specific example. I was in favor of Nick Fuentes, for example, being reinstated on X, simply because it's a free speech issue. As long as he's not breaking the law, I think he should be allowed to speak. I don't have to listen to him. I can block him.
Hmm.
I can refute him, and I can ridicule him. Those are the proper responses in my mind. Not saying he can't be here because he has views that I don't like, or he says hateful or harmful things. Um, he's not violating the law. And so I think that any moderation that goes too far beyond, you know, the unlawful speech, things like incitement to violence, like an actual call for violence, or actually threatening somebody's life, or this really intense kind of bullying and harassment and telling somebody to go kill themselves or something awful like that. Like if you when you're dealing with those things, it's different, because you can't do that under the First Amendment either.
Hmm.
There are examples of unlawful speech, but if it's lawful, if it's opinion, and even if it's opinions that you don't like, I think that it should be permitted, even if I strongly disagree with them. And I've tried to be consistent on that myself.
I think my issue is more the inconsistency with which things are applied. So if you have rules like, hey, you can't harass people or you can't dox people or whatever, or you can't say these words and attack somebody, you could decide not to have these rules, but if you have them, they
They
should
should be
be
applied
enforced.
consistently, yes, across the
Yeah.
board. Yeah. Yeah, inconsistent application of the rules is unfair and discriminatory, and it does amount to censorship. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm curious, do you think there's lines in humor, satire versus cruelty? Because I think we see that a lot, that line being blurred a bit.
um, yes. Well, so there's definitely there jokes can be cruel. Like you can be. I mentioned the word. I mentioned bullying just a moment ago. Like if you're bullying somebody for the express purpose of putting them down and making them feel bad about themselves, I think that's very different than challenging their conduct, pointing out their double standards, ridiculing the bad ideas of a public figure, and the silliness or harmfulness of them. Um, there's definitely a distinction between those two things. What we try to engage in is mockery that's aimed at foolishness, so that the foolishness is exposed for what it is, so that it isn't taken seriously. It's not mockery for the purpose of just putting people down and making them feel bad about themselves, which I disagree with. I don't think that that's morally right to do. So yeah, lines, sure, but not in the sense that there's certain things that are politically incorrect that we shouldn't say. We don't want to hurt people's feelings by telling the truth with a joke that people are going to find offensive. Comedy is always going to be offensive. Somebody and their bad ideas are always going to be the butt of the joke, and they're going to become very angry about that. And if you were to try to tiptoe around that and say, I don't want to offend anyone, but I want to do comedy, well, good luck, because you can't do satire and comedy without offending the people that are being confronted with the jokes. So the truth is offensive, jokes are offensive, and simply offending people is not something that I think is wrong, because oftentimes, an offensive truth, for example, can be the most loving thing that you can tell somebody. They might be very upset by it. Their pride might be hurt. Their feelings might be hurt. But it doesn't mean that you're doing it for the purpose of hurting them, just because of how they react. And you can't be controlled by their emotions in that way. And so there's very nuanced discussions to be had there about that. But generally, I would say, yes, there are, of course, things that you shouldn't do, that are morally wrong to do, that are hurtful just for the sake of being hurtful. And that isn't behavior that we would want to engage in.
Yeah, and this is something that has really hurt creative people where I've listened into conversations with comedians and also talked to people, friends of mine who are, work in writers' rooms. And there is this like, there's certain things you're not allowed to joke about. And everybody's sort of tiptoeing and eggshells. So a lot of comedians have been just kind of demoralized. And, some have turned sides, some have just kind of stopped doing very much. Um, so I don't know. Are we going to get comedy back?
I think to a large extent we have already. There are some big name comedians who have pushed back and actually told, excuse me, some of the jokes that they weren't supposed to tell. And I respect them for doing that, because I think it's their right to tell them. And I think that the jokes that they don't want you to tell are oftentimes the ones that absolutely must be told. A lot of times what I see that I think is problematic isn't that, humor can be so harmful. It's the idea that, well, it's the idea that humor is treated as harmful when it confronts ideas that are being protected by the powers that be. So an example of this is the joke that got us kicked off of Twitter. This was a violation of the misgendering policy. It was considered punching down. This is the language that Facebook adopted in a more recent revision to their terms of service, where they were trying to put guardrails in place for what kind of satire and comedy would be allowed. They're like, well, you can do satire and comedy, but you can't punch down, meaning you can't, from a position of privilege and power, make fun of people who lack power and privilege because they're marginalized, they're oppressed. And if you make fun of them or their ideas, then it's abusive. You are punching down. And that I find problematic, because what they're actually trying to protect there is not people. They're not trying to protect people from being hurt. They're trying to protect their ideology from being criticized. In the case of, the Rachel Levine joke that we told, I strongly reject the idea that this joke was punching down in a way that was abusive or unfair, because we were not, in fact, in a position of power joking about someone who lacks it. We were joking about an idea that's being pushed from the top down on the culture, from the most powerful institutions, including the government. And this is first of all, a white male high-ranking government official, right? Like, this is all the power and privilege exists in the corner of people like Rachel Levine and Dylan Mulvaney, like and when we're telling jokes about these ideas, the idea that a man can become a woman or whatever, and get pregnant, these ideas, because they're being pushed on us from the top down, when you're joking about them, you are actually doing the comedian's job of punching up and exposing the foolishness of the ideas that are being pushed on people, and for the purpose, by the way, of protecting people, not harming them, but protecting them from the bad ideas and the outcomes that come from those ideas. And so I just couldn't disagree more strongly with the idea that humor is harmful because it punches down or can be exploited that way, and is being abused that way. I think that was again another one of those tactics that was meant to control thought and speech, to shield not people's feelings, but certain ideology from criticism.
Now that Trump is in power, are you planning on punching up more at him? And I mean, I'm sure people are going to get very mad at you when you do. How do you kind of ensure that you're comedically well balanced?
Yeah, I mean, we will continue to make fun of whatever we think deserves it. So, it will sometimes be him, and it will sometimes be the opposition to him. It will be wherever we think there's something that needs mockery, whatever needs to be ridiculed. I think the mission to ridicule bad ideas is one that applies to whoever is holding them and advancing them. And double standards exist everywhere. So, yeah, I mean, I just don't like the terminology itself, punching up, punching down. Like, I think that if we want to think of each other as equals, we should be willing to joke about each other and our ideas indiscriminately, and that's the way of treating each other equally, rather than having rules about who or what we can joke about. But I do think that generally speaking, poking holes in whatever the popular narrative is kind of a responsibility of humorists, satirists, comedians, and if you're deliberately propping up the popular narrative and protecting it and preventing criticism of it, you're not really doing your job.
So equal opportunity mockery is
Yes.
equal human rights, essentially.
Yes.
Last question for you. Um, can conservatives really be funny without having liberals to make fun of?
Yeah, well, this is the thing. We're often described, and I don't think it's entirely unfair. We're often described as conservative comedy. Whenever when someone's talking about The Onion or Saturday Night Live or whatever, they're not calling it leftist comedy or liberal comedy or progressive comedy. Like, they don't put those qualifiers, those terms
Mhm.
on the front of it. They just call it comedy or satire. But what really, honestly, in truth, they're very politically motivated. They're protecting ideas they want to protect, and they're going after the ones that they want to attack. And so, to treat just one side as being like, okay, well, there's comedy and then there's conservative comedy. Well, we're trying to be funny. We're just trying to be funny and tell jokes and that make people laugh and that make them think and that have, like you said, a grain of truth in them. We want to tell the truth and speak truth to what we consider to be a post-truth culture. So, if you happen to be a conservative who's doing comedy, um, you know, I think in a climate and an environment where secular progressive ideology is dominant, and it still is, largely. It's there is this vibe shift that we're all experiencing and seeing, where a lot of these things are becoming less popular, but for a very long time, for very many years, they have been popular, and so it's a target-rich environment for someone who has a conservative worldview and is doing comedy. it will be less target rich as the world returns to. I think it's more, rather than thinking of it in political terms, it's more like the more absurd the world is, the more there is, to make fun of. And the more sane the world is, the less there is to make fun of.
I don't
So,
see it turning sane anytime soon. So I
yeah,
think comedians are safe.
yeah, comedians are safe as long as the world is insane.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the requirement. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate our conversation and getting to hear your perspective. And I hope comedy stays thriving. Whoever tells the jokes, as long as they're funny, I'm happy to listen because I want to laugh.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think the important thing to walk away with is that, humor isn't harmful. And I think I think our society was healthier when we were all more willing to laugh at each other and ourselves. And I think it's a very healthy exercise to be able to not be so perpetually offended by everything, and allowing and having, like, we're cultivating this thin skin, I'm a victim, I need to be in a safe space mentality. I think it's bad for young people. I think it doesn't build resilience. I think being able to have a sense of humor, be able to laugh at yourself is a healthy character building, spiritually strengthening exercise. And so humor is a good thing. It's not harmful, and we shouldn't treat it as such.
I couldn't agree more. Even if we disagree on many other things,
Yeah.
I definitely agree there.
Next time you have me on, let's talk about the things we really disagree on, and we'll
That'd be
debate each
fun,
other.
actually. I feel
Yeah.
like I don't do that enough. Like, I sometimes will bring on somebody where I think I'm going to disagree with them more, but I think I have a tendency to want to find the commonalities,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's hard to get out of that. But it's really fun to talk to people who are good faith, who have a truly different perspective, but it's well informed. Like, I don't I don't really enjoy it if it's like if the person's arguments are actually weak or based on
Mm,
falsehoods, because it doesn't give me anything, right? Because ultimately what I want to hear the strongest possible argument to counter my own, so that I could like either improve my own or else change my mind if the person is right. So
right.
that's what I want more of. And unfortunately, I think we're living in very segregated times and environments where it's like one person's, somebody who's on this side stays on there and the other person on there. And it's just barking at each other.
Yeah.
And it's just not helpful, I think, for discourse at all.
No. But we have to be willing. I like that. The steel manning that you're talking about, trying to hear the best of the other side. And then that actually helps you understand whether or not you're standing on solid ground yourself, and whether you have good arguments. So that's healthy discourse too. But thank you. Appreciate you
100%.
having me on. And if you want to do this again sometime and disagree about some stuff, happy to let the sparks fly. We'll do that next time.
Let's do that. That would be fun.
All
I'll
right.
enjoy that. Okay.